we're going to look at sighting where we actually measure a visual measurement on the object. This is the easiest way to do sighting because you can actually pick up the object and hold it. And so for a lot of reasons, it's easier. You don't have to deal with perspective. Your measurement is going to be 1-to-1, so whatever we measure on the object can be the same measurement that we're aiming for on the page. The other thing is that you don't have to hold your hand out like I'm going to show you later. You're going to hold your arm out like this. Your hand wobbles around, it's unsteady, it's a little bit difficult to take those measurements. However, you would not be able to measure something large like this, say a car or a building, because you're not going to have a tape measure in your bag, in your drawing supplies, that's long enough to go with that. And you're not going to look online and try to find the footprint measurement of a famous building that you're drawing. You're actually just going to look at the picture and you're going to take measurements on the picture or on the object in this case. So if you're out in the field trying to draw a building, you're not going to be able to do this, but this is going to be great for your smaller objects or for photographs. I'll show you photographs later in another video. Okay, so remember that we're going to take 2 measurements. You always have to take 2 measurements when you're using visual measuring instead of mathematical measuring, because one measurement in isolation tells us nothing about the size of the object. It's the relationship, the proportion, the relationship between sizes that's going to reveal so much more about both measurements so that we can make sure that they're accurate. The first step is I'm actually going to set these down and I'm going to pick up my pencil and I'm going to take my best guess about this object. I'm going to show you how it looks. Well, actually, let's do it like this. I'll hold it up here so that you guys can see it in the camera. And then I'm going to draw that as best as I can. So my best guess for the actual width is about that length. And you can see I made a lot of lines. I'm kind of tired right now, so I'm not trusting that my first line is going to be accurate. The next thing I'm going to do is take my best guess. This is my structural line. You can go back and watch the structural line video if you want to learn a little bit more about that. This is my best guess for what this width is going to be from the top here to the bottom here at both of the lowest points of the curves. And then that was my best guess for the widest point of the curve at the width here. And then I want to consider the depth. With the depth, I'm going to draw that on my page as a height. So I'm going to add a box here to show where the depth would be. And again, this is just my best educated guess. I'm keeping my measurements with what I can see. And I'm actually not going to scale this drawing up or down. I'm trying to make it life size. So making it equal size is okay. Next, I'm going to show you how to take those measurements on the object. Okay, so this next part of sighting on the actual object, I'm going to teach you how to take your measurements. This can get a little bit complex, so hopefully I won't lose you. If I do, just remember, go back and listen to this section again so that you can make sense of it and then try to apply it yourself. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to compare the width to the height. And the way that I'm going to do that, it's a little bit awkward because typically what I would want is to have this out in front of me and to have you have the view that I'm having, and then I would measure on the object. But there's no way for me to set the camera up to show you that exactly, so I'm going to hold this like this, and hopefully it's going to be about the view where I drew my structural line most consistently. It might wiggle around a little bit, but I'll try to do my best to hold it still. So I'm going to measure the width here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up the dowel at the end where the left side of the width of the cup is. And then I'm going to use my thumb, not my finger or my pinchers together. I'm going to use my thumbnail like this to mark where the edge is at the widest point on this side. So you can see there's my width. Okay, I'm going to hold that measurement now and compare it to something else because that width by itself doesn't really tell me anything. So next I'm going to compare it to the height. And you can see that I'm going to line up my thumb here at the bottom of the middle section of the curve, so at the widest point of the curve, And the end of the dowel marks the end of the width, but you can see that my height is slightly longer than my width. So now I've created a relationship in my mind between those two measurements. The height is just a smidge, which is an official measurement when you're sighting. The height is a smidge longer than the width. Now I want to actually go back and compare that to the page. So now we've created that ratio in our mind between our height and our width on the actual object. Let's look back at the page and then we'll be able to see if our ratio that we created with our structural line guess is accurate or not. I'm going to set this down in order to do that. Remember that I measured the width first. Sometimes I have to rearrange my supplies so that my dowel will fit on the page well. So I'm going to measure here from the end of the dowel at the end of the width of my structural line box. And then with my thumb, I'm going to mark the right side edge. And then I'm going to compare. So usually for me, it's a little bit easier if I twist the page. And remember that I line up my thumb here with the bottom edge of the length. And then I'm going to look at this gap and see if it looks like it's about the same. If I need to, I can go back onto my object and measure the width here. You can see those measurements that I guessed were not that far off. They were a little bit smaller. And then I'm going to look at that relationship again. There's just a tiny gap right there. So I want a similar relationship here. My size is a little bit smaller on the page, it looks like. And then my gap is a little bit larger. So that tells me that either I need to make my width wider, and that would require changing all of these lines, or I need to make my length a little bit shorter. I always just take a guess at which one is going to be the simplest. I'm lazy. I want to just make the easiest change possible with the fewest lines involved. And I always make my new line first and erase my old line. That was my helper line. It showed me what I needed to change. And then I'm going to remeasure. So I'm going to take this width measurement again, and I'm going to compare it to the height and look at that gap. And now that looks much more similar to what I was seeing on my actual object. And so this, to me, is actually a more accurate relationship of my proportions. The one thing that I think is really helpful to keep in mind is that sometimes when you're measuring something very small and trying to fit it into an object or another measurement that's very large, say for example, a wine bottle. If you were to measure the opening of a wine bottle, which is really narrow, and then, so the opening would be measured as a height, and then if you were to try to turn that depth that winds up being measured as a height and try to count how many of those openings could go into the height of a bottle, you would wind up with probably about 20 of them in the height of a bottle. That relationship makes it very difficult to get accurate. Whenever you have a smaller measurement, when you're sighting, it's always more challenging than a larger measurement with sighting. It's just difficult to get it accurate. So instead, when I'm creating ratios in my mind, or fractions or relationships between these sizes, I always want to keep it to the most simplest relationships possible. So usually, like if I can find something that's half the length of something else, or a third of the length of something else, or a fourth or a fifth of the length of something else, I will create those relationships like that. Once it gets any smaller than a fifth and you start to get into sixths and sevenths and eighths, it's just much too difficult to get those measured accurately and then portrayed accurately on your page. So keep it really simple. Quarters, thirds, halves are the best relationships that you can create. So you always want to try to find something maybe smaller and then compare it to something larger to see how many times it fits in. Remember, sighting can be really confusing. So this is the first step of sighting where you're measuring on the actual object. My next videos are going to be measuring with the object from a distance and then creating a small key so that you can make measurements and take those measurements again from your page rather than having to hold your arm up. So if you get confused along the way, please send me an email, write a comment in the section so that I can respond to it and try to clarify your questions. And remember, just watch some of the sections over and then apply it so that you can learn how to do this. The best way to learn is by practicing and by allowing yourself to mess up. I mess up all the time. You guys have seen me mess up on these videos, so it's okay to make mistakes, and just try again. So let me know how it goes, and hopefully this really assists you in making more accurate proportions with your drawings in the future. Thank you all so much for watching. More videos are coming soon, so if you wish to subscribe to my channel, go ahead and do that. And also you can check out my website, lzmstudio.com.